When people speak of sexual abstinence, the conversation usually begins and ends with self-control. It's framed as a moral choice, a religious requirement, or a health precaution. But what no one tells you is that sexual abstinence, when practiced with awareness, can become a doorway into something far more powerful: transformation, because sexual energy is not merely about biology or pleasure. At its core, it is a raw, primal force that, when redirected, holds the capacity to create, imagine, and evolve. This energy is the same one that drives reproduction in nature, but in human beings, it goes beyond the physical. It is connected to the psyche, the unconscious, the drive to unite opposites. Abstinence, therefore, isn't just a pause or denial of desire. It's a conscious redirection of that force. When sexual energy is not discharged outwardly, it doesn't disappear. It builds, condenses, and begins to move within. And when this movement is inward, it starts to feed other areas of the self: creativity, ambition, vision, and spiritual insight. Artists throughout history have known this intuitively. Poets, philosophers, and mystics often lived periods of deliberate celibacy, not as acts of denial, but as a way to transmute the energy into higher forms of expression. They understood that this energy, if not spent on gratification, could be transformed into art, wisdom, and inner expansion. This process is called sublimation, a psychological transformation where instinctual drives are redirected into socially or spiritually valuable outlets. But this redirection does not happen automatically. It requires intention, discipline, and inner work. Without these, the energy may turn inward in destructive ways, into anxiety, obsession, or neurotic tension. The transformation of sexual energy is not a bypassing of desire. It's a conscious engagement with it. To abstain meaningfully means to listen to desire, understand its language, and then channel it toward a deeper purpose. It is a dance between impulse and intention, instinct and imagination. In abstinence, one learns to hold energy, not release it. This holding can feel intense. The body begins to store the charge of desire like a container, filling with pressure. But if the individual can withstand the tension without collapsing into repression or indulgence, that pressure starts to carve new channels in the psyche, and here, one begins to feel more alive, more aware of internal forces, more capable of concentrated thought and emotional depth. This is the beginning of inner alchemy, where the raw lead of instinct is slowly turned into the gold of consciousness. For some, this transformation shows up in bursts of creative output. For others, it emerges as sudden clarity, the ability to perceive the hidden layers of experience. In either case, the common thread is that sexual abstinence, far from being empty or lifeless, can awaken a profound reservoir of potential. It's not about missing out on pleasure, but about discovering another form of it, one that is subtler, longer-lasting, and anchored in meaning. In traditional cultures and mystery schools, this was understood and even ritualized. Sexual energy was considered sacred, not because it needed to be feared, but because it could be harnessed. To withhold it was not a punishment, but an initiation into power. Modern society, by contrast, views any form of abstinence as deprivation. Yet what is often missed is that withholding desire can lead to the emergence of the self, more whole, more centered, more attuned to the symbolic dimensions of life. Sexual energy, then, is not something to escape or suppress. It is something to work with. It is fire, and fire can burn, or it can illuminate. Suppression is not the same as mastery. One of the most misunderstood aspects of sexual abstinence is the assumption that it simply means turning desire off, locking it away, or pretending it doesn't exist. This is not mastery. It is suppression, and suppression is not only unsustainable, it is dangerous. To repress desire is to bury it beneath the surface of consciousness, where it begins to ferment, distort, and find darker ways to express itself. What no one tells you about abstinence is that its true power lies not in shutting down the sexual impulse, but in transforming your relationship with it. Desire is one of the most powerful psychic forces within the human being. It is not limited to sex, it is the drive for connection, for union, for wholeness. When abstinence is approached unconsciously from a place of fear, guilt, or self-loathing, it often becomes a battleground. The conscious mind declares war on the instinctual self, treating desire as an enemy. But in doing so, the individual divides their psyche. What is repressed does not disappear. It descends into the unconscious, becoming part of what psychologists call the shadow. And the shadow always seeks expression. This is why many who outwardly practice abstinence find themselves inwardly consumed by fantasies, obsessions, or compulsions. Their bodies may be restrained, but their inner world is chaotic. They become haunted by what they refuse to face. Repression, then, is not freedom from desire. It is captivity to it in its most uncontrolled form. True abstinence, by contrast, is not the silencing of desire, but the integration of it. It requires looking directly at one's sexual energy, acknowledging it without judgment, and choosing consciously how to relate to it. Mastery begins with awareness. It means recognizing when desire arises, observing its form, its texture, its intensity, and asking, what does this energy want? What is it pointing me toward? Often, sexual desire masks a deeper longing for intimacy, for meaning, for union with something greater than the self. If this desire is immediately suppressed, its deeper message is lost. If it is indulged without reflection, its deeper purpose is also lost. But if it is held in conscious awareness, allowed to unfold without immediate reaction, it becomes a guide. In this way, abstinence becomes a form of inner listening. This is not easy work. To hold desire without collapsing into it or fleeing from it requires strength. But this is the strength of the mature psyche, the one that has learned to carry tension, to dwell in paradox. Mastery is about staying present with one's impulses, not denying them. It is about creating space between stimulus and response. In that space, the unconscious becomes visible. Moody. Symbols, dreams, and unexpected insights begin to arise. The energy once trapped in instinct begins to flow upward, feeding the higher functions of imagination, intuition, and will. Many confuse control with suppression, but suppression is brittle, it is rigid, and it eventually breaks. Mastery is fluid, responsive, and rooted in self-knowledge. The person who has mastered their sexual energy is not one who never feels desire, but one who no longer fears it. They have met it, studied it, negotiated with it. They understand that desire is not the enemy of spiritual or psychological growth. It is often the starting point, but only when it is treated with respect, not shame. In this context, abstinence becomes a practice not of rejection, but of relationship. It is not about building walls, but about building capacity. The capacity to hold heat without being burned. The capacity to engage the force of desire without being controlled by it. The capacity to move from unconscious reaction to conscious participation. This kind of abstinence is not the product of willpower alone, but of inner alignment, where the instinctual and the rational no longer wage war, but begin to speak in the same language. Facing the shadow self-sexual abstinence, when undertaken with awareness, can quickly become more than a behavioral choice. It becomes a mirror. What no one tells you is that the act of abstaining doesn't eliminate desire. It illuminates it. It forces desire to rise, not as a bodily impulse alone, but as something psychological, symbolic, and often uncomfortable. In this rising, the individual is confronted by something many avoid their entire lives: the shadow. The shadow is the hidden part of the self, made up of instincts, impulses, fears, and traits we reject or fail to recognize in ourselves. It is not inherently evil, but it is repressed, denied, and buried, often for the sake of social conformity, ego preservation, or moral idealism. Sexual desire, when not immediately satisfied or sublimated, tends to stir the contents of this shadow. And so, abstinence becomes more than a physical restraint. It becomes an invitation to face what has been exiled within. Many who begin a period of abstinence quickly discover that suppressed feelings, forgotten memories, or irrational fantasies begin to surface. These are not random disturbances. They are messengers. They carry information from the parts of the psyche we have ignored or disowned. When sexual gratification is removed, the unconscious seizes the opportunity to make itself known. It fills the vacant space with images, symbols, dreams, or even anxieties. This is not pathology. It is process. It is the psyche seeking wholeness by demanding recognition of its hidden parts. What no one warns you about is how intense this confrontation can be. The shadow does not arrive gently. It often takes the form of shameful thoughts, intrusive desires, envy, or resentment. For someone conditioned to see themselves as a pure, a disciplined, or in control, these intrusions can feel like inner betrayal. But the real betrayal is not in having a shadow. It is in denying that it exists. Abstinence, especially over time, strips away the distractions and comforts that help keep the shadow buried. It lays bare the internal split between who we think we are and who we really are. To face the shadow is not to indulge it. It is to witness it without judgment, to become curious about it. To ask, why does this image disturb me? Why does this fantasy recur? What longing lies beneath this discomfort? These questions do not provide instant relief, but they begin the work of integration. And integration is the true goal. Not suppression, not indulgence, but wholeness. This is where abstinence becomes psychological labor. It is no longer just about not doing something. It becomes a confrontation with one's inner architecture. One begins to see how desire is shaped by wounds, how attraction is often entangled with trauma, how fantasies may be compensating for unmet emotional needs. These insights are not meant to eliminate desire, but to deepen understanding of it. Through this process, the sexual impulse becomes less chaotic, less compulsive, and more available for conscious transformation. In many ways, abstinence creates the stillness necessary for this work. In a world saturated with stimulation and distraction, abstinence can serve as a kind of inner retreat. The silence it creates is not empty. It is echoing with the voice of the unconscious. The shadow speaks most clearly when external outlets are closed. But it speaks in riddles, symbols, and contradictions. It does not offer quick answers. It asks for presence. To walk this path is to risk discomfort, but also to gain authenticity. The individual begins to see themselves more clearly, not as a curated identity, but as a complex, living whole. Sexual abstinence becomes a crucible for this confrontation. It is not an escape from sexuality, but a descent into its deeper meanings. It brings the seeker face to face with their own depths, where eros and fear, love and shame, instinct and insight converge in the unseen territory of the self. Heightened intuition and dreams in the stillness that comes with sexual abstinence, something subtle but profound begins to awaken, an amplification of the inner senses. Sexual abstinence, rather than cutting one off from life, draws one deeper into it. Not as mere observer, but as participant in an unfolding psychological reality, abstinence as a rite of inner initiation in modern culture. Sexual abstinence is often reduced to a utilitarian choice, something done for religious obedience, health concerns, or social convenience. But what remains largely unspoken is that abstinence, when chosen consciously, can serve as a rite of inner initiation. It becomes a threshold between the familiar self and a deeper, more individuated identity. Abstinence, in this sense, is not merely the avoidance of sexual activity, but the symbolic withdrawal from one world into another. It echoes the ancient process of initiation, where the individual steps away from the collective rhythm to encounter the mystery of their own psyche. Every initiation demands separation. In traditional societies, initiates were removed from the everyday world, taken into silence, darkness, solitude, solitude, solitude. They were stripped of comforts and identities. This rupture was not punishment, it was preparation. To move into a new state of being, the old one had to die symbolically. Similarly, sexual abstinence begins with a withdrawal from one of the most instinctual and socially embedded forms of gratification. This withdrawal shakes the foundations. The body protests. The ego resists. The mind races. But beneath the turbulence, something ancient stirs. Something ancient stirs. When sex is no longer available, as a form of escape, distraction, or affirmation, the initiate is left face to face with the raw substance of selfhood. Desires rise. Memories surface. Fantasies intensify. These are not obstacles to purity. They are the curriculum of the initiation. The individual is being asked to witness, endure, and interpret the forces that previously flowed unnoticed beneath the surface. The heat of abstinence begins to melt the false self, the one propped up by compulsions, cravings, and external validation. Initiation is never comfortable. It dismantles before it reveals. The one who enters abstinence with romantic notions of spiritual superiority is often humbled quickly. What arises is not a clean detachment, but confrontation with loneliness, with hunger, with buried emotions and unmet needs. But this confrontation is the point. Abstinence as initiation is the furnace in which ego structures are tested and reformed. It is where dependency is challenged and authenticity is born. Many people assume that transformation happens through addition, more knowledge, more practice, more input. But in initiation, transformation often comes through subtraction. Abstinence removes a familiar stimulus. It creates a void. And in that void, the inner world becomes audible. The silence grows loud. The shadows begin to speak. One becomes a stranger in their own skin for a time. The old maps no longer guide. This is the liminal space, neither here nor there. It is the space between the known and the unknown, the social self and the deeper self. In this space, something extraordinary becomes possible. The individual begins to experience a shift, not dramatic or performative, but internal, subtle, and sacred. A new kind of strength is forged, not the strength of domination or denial, but the quiet strength of self-possession. One learns to contain without collapsing, to endure without escaping, to observe without acting. This containment is not repression. It is the vessel in which transformation brews. Symbols may appear, not just in dreams, but in waking life. The psyche begins to organize itself differently. New values emerge. What once seemed essential begins to fall away. The desire for pleasure is gradually replaced by the desire for meaning, and meaning does not come from the external world. It arises from within, through the painful, beautiful labor of becoming. Abstinence becomes less about what is being resisted and more about what is being revealed. It trains the emotional body to tolerate space, and in doing so, to mature. Solitude also becomes a creative space. Freed from the cycle of pursuit and gratification, the individual often finds themselves more attuned to art, nature, thought, and inner symbolism. The world becomes more textured, more meaningful, not because something new has appeared, but because the internal noise has quieted enough to perceive what was always there. The gaze turns inward, not in narcissism, but in curiosity. What am I without the other? What does my own presence feel like when no one is watching? These are not questions of despair, but of deepening. They are the kind of questions that only arise in solitude, when the silence of abstinence becomes fertile rather than frightening. The frightening.